In 1557, a young man was dragged through the streets of London in front of thousands of people. His destination was Tyburn, the infamous place of execution, where throughout the centuries many people were subjected to the most harrowing and barbaric of deaths. This young man was to be executed by being hanged, drawn and quartered, but his crime was one which was strange and also disturbing. 4 years previously, King Edward VI, Henry VIII's son and the Tudor boy king, had died at the age of 15 inside of Greenwich Palace, suffering from a very serious lung issue and condition. But some people, to oppose Mary I and her Catholic regime, began to consider that the boy Tudor king was still alive, and that he was not dead after all, and that Queen Mary was a usurper. The man taken to Tyburn for his execution was William Featherstone, a young man who had claimed to have been Edward VI, and he was a pretender of Henry VIII's son, but he was dealt with brutally. Welcome to the fortress. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Very little is actually known about the life of William Featherstone, besides the fact he was an 18-year-old man who was the son of a miller and someone who was a servant of Peter Mutas, a courtier who served in the court of King Henry VIII. One of Featherstone's parents worked for this man, who became a gentleman of the Privy Chamber to the notorious sixth-wifed king, and he was someone who would have come into contact with Henry VIII, and especially his children, regularly. William Featherstone in February 1555 would make a shocking claim. He claimed that he was in fact King Edward VI, and that he had been in hiding. Edward VI died on the 6th of July 1553, and he had suffered a very painful and brutal death at the hands of a chronic and serious lung condition. Edward VI in his dying days had changed the Act of Succession to allow his cousin Lady Jane Grey to come on the throne, and she would go down in history as a 9-day queen before she was deposed by Queen Mary I, Edward's half-sister and Henry VIII's eldest daughter. Edward VI's condition worsened in early 1553, and he had very few appearances amongst the general public, and he was last seen by the public on the 1st of July 1553, and he showed himself at a window inside of Greenwich Palace, and those who saw him claimed he was thin and wasted. But within the week the king was dead, and he succumbed to his illness at 8 p.m. on the 6th of July 1553, and his final words were allegedly, "I am faint, Lord have mercy upon me, and take my spirit." After his death his body was allegedly opened up, and it was found that Edward had a disease of the lungs, or possibly suffered from tuberculosis. But some people believe that Edward VI had been poisoned by Catholics in an attempt to bring Queen Mary I onto the throne. William Featherstone, by claiming to be Edward VI during Mary's rule, was committing a very serious and dangerous crime. This was treason, as his claim caused Mary a headache and a challenge to her rule, and throughout history there are a number of people who pretended to be former princes or kings. Most famously, people pretended to be the princes in the Tower, and usually pretenders were dealt with ruthlessly and brutally. Featherstone, for claiming that he was a dead king, was arrested in Southwark, in London, and he was then dragged across London to Hampton Court Palace. He was forced to sit in front of Queen Mary I's Privy Council, who then interrogated him to make sure that he was without doubt a pretender and a liar, and then during this investigation he claimed that he'd been ordered by others to pretend to be Mary's dead half-brother. This would have without doubt plunged Mary into a great sense of fear and trepidation, and she was very fearful of threats to her throne, and she usually dealt with them very seriously. Featherstone's admission, despite the fact he claimed that he was told by others to do it, had caused such panic that the Privy Council did not trust him. They thought that he had not been told by others to do this, and they claimed that he was a lunatic fool, and for this he was then sent and locked up inside of London's Marshalsea prison. This was a notorious lock-up and prison south of the River Thames in Suffolk, and it was a place where torture was administered upon prisoners, and later it became a debtor's prison. There were devices such as the scavenger's daughter, thumbscrews and the skull cap, a terrifying head-crushing device which was used. Prisoners were also manacled, and they were beaten regularly too. It's likely that William Featherstone encountered this sort of treatment, as he was someone who the Privy Council wanted information from. They would have been very concerned about a bigger threat to Mary's rule. But in May 1555, he was dragged out to Westminster Hall, and was shown to the public for what he was, an impostor and a criminal. He was then whipped badly to punish him, and this treatment at Westminster Hall was done to shame him and put him off committing further crimes. It was also performed to show the people of London Mary I's strength and rule, and that she would not stand for this sort of action and behaviour inside of her England. Mary I was, after all, the monarch and queen who burned over 200 people at the stake for their religious beliefs and convictions. But William Featherstone continued to strangely admit that he was involved with King Edward VI. Instead of saying that he was Edward, he now actually claimed to others that the dead king was alive and that he had personally spoken to him. This was equally as dangerous for Mary, and it was a crime which was dealt with very seriously. Featherstone was dragged back into prison and was held under lock and key for the crime of high treason, and for this he was sentenced to death. He was locked up in prison until the 13th of March 1557, when he was informed that the date of his execution had come. He was taken to Tyburn to be hanged, drawn and quartered. This has gone down in history as one of the most brutal and barbaric executions for men to suffer in Britain during the medieval and Tudor period. This multi-step execution method was completely ruthless and resulted in someone's body being reduced to very little, with their body parts being separated and sent to be displayed in different towns. It was a sign of the monarchy's power, and it was a primary punishment for high treason, a crime against the monarchy which could threaten their life and power. When judges gave out the punishment, it was said that it would be carried out in this way. The condemned was to be laid on a hurdle, and so drawn to the place of execution, and there be hanged, cut down alive, your members to be cut off and cast in the fire, your bowels burned before you, your head smitten off, and your body quartered and divided at the king or queen's will, and God have mercy on your soul. William Featherstone had been dragged through the streets of London, and when he got to Tyburn he was handed over to the executioner. A crowd of thousands had gathered to witness his execution, and they wanted to see the executioner make a brutal job of his death. Hanging, drawing and quartering was very popular with the crowds, such was the brutality of the execution, and Featherstone was placed below the gallows, and the executioner secured the noose around his neck, and then pulled down on one end of the rope, choking the life out of him and hoisting him into the air. He continued to struggle and struggle, but just before death occurred, the executioner let go of the rope and made sure he was still alive. He was then taken over to the executioner's table, and with a sharp knife the executioner cut off Featherstone's genitals and then threw them into a fire which had been lit. He then disemboweled him and pulled out his entrails and threw them into the fire. His head was then hacked off by an axe and his body cut up into quarters. Featherstone's remains were then, following this, sent to different towns and cities to be displayed in a manner that Mary I believed was right to show her power. His head was carried east by the River Thames to London Bridge and was passed to the Keeper of the Heads, who dipped it in tar and then placed it 30 feet high above the gatehouse to show the people of London what happened to traitors. William Featherstone's fate and execution was a brutal and ruthless one, but he was someone who was considered a very serious criminal and who was accused of the crime of high treason. He was one of Mary I's most forgotten victims, but he may have been someone who today would be considered mentally ill. He claimed that he was a dead king, and something was not right with him. However, during the Tudor period, his actions were enough for him to be executed in the most brutal way. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.